Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar. We thank Apex Brazil. Boa noite a todos. Gostaria de agradecer a Apex Brasil pelo apoio à realização de mais um webinar para a indústria de games. Sou Eliana Russo, represento a Abra Games e o projeto de exportação Brasil Games. Estamos aqui como parte da programação do Big Festival, mais um webinar. Hoje a gente vai ter conosco o David Nixon, do Mobile Game Doctors. Ele vai falar bastante sobre pitch, como modelar melhor seu projeto. Enfim, acho que vai ser um webinar bem bacana para todos. Thank you all. I hope you enjoy. And I'd like to invite Alessandro Biolo from Exola. Exola is our partner in this webinar. And thanks, Alessandro. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eliana. Well, it's a pleasure to be collaborating with Abra Games and with all the Brazilian development community and the Latin community as well. Exola wants to accelerate the developers in Latin America, and this is why we are bringing you this great seminar, as you said, bacano, really good for learning about monetization strategies. David is a veteran with more than 30 years experience in the industry, and he specializes on game development for free-to-play games. So I think it will be a great show. And thank you, Eliana, for the collaboration, and I really appreciate it. Obrigado to all the community in Brazil.
Obrigado a todos. Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you, Exola. Let's welcome David to the stage. David, I think you are on and we are out. So have fun. Enjoy, everybody.
Thank you very much. Let's see. I need to get the slides going here. There they are. Thank you for inviting me. And even though I can't see you, I know that there's lots of people that are watching this webinar today, and I want to thank you as well for joining us today. My name is David Nixon, and I'll tell you a little bit more about myself as we get a bit later into the presentation. I made this webinar because a lot of people came to me over the last 2 years and said, I need to make more money in my game. And that the answer to making more money in your game is more complicated than most people realize. And so I wanted to find a way to explain to people the relationship between retention and monetization in free-to-play games as I've observed it over the last 7 years or so. In particular, I made this presentation for people who are currently working on in-app purchase systems for an existing or new game. Or perhaps you have a game that's currently dependent upon advertising revenue, but you'd like to extend those systems to support IAP as well. Or you have in-app purchases systems in your game, but they're not working as well as you'd like them to, and you need to improve them. I'm not going to be going into advanced monetization strategies like dynamic personalized offers or dynamic offer trees or price skimming or purchase trigger modeling or any of that stuff in this presentation. I'm going to focus around creating a framework for thinking about how monetization works in a particular system and how to target your monetization systems towards particular player motivations. As a quick overview, because I know when I have these presentations in the past, there's a high percentage of the audience that is really in the business of ad-driven or hyper-casual games, and they're looking at IP-driven economies as a way to extend their monetization footprint. There are substantial differences between how you design a game that's going to be ad-driven and how you design a game that's going to be IAP-driven. And to some extent, these are mutually exclusive. And in particular, ad-driven games tend to go in clusters. They tend to be a simple mechanic that has broad appeal because such games require a very low CPI in order to acquire profitably. You're looking at a ROAS goal of less than 30 days. That's return on ad spend. They tend to have very low monetization rates and few options for monetization improvement, which is why those companies are looking to get into the IAP business. On the other hand, IAP-driven games tend to be more complex, both mechanically and in the design of the metagame. And while less than 10% of people purchase, 80% watch ads, but most of the monetization comes from the IAPs. They do tend to have much higher ARPU and they're marketed in very different ways. So this migration is a major one. It's not a minor one. Although there is some interesting work being done by Voodoo and Graham Games to sort of walk the line between ad-driven and IAP-driven games these days. To make sure that everybody has a mutual understanding of some of the terms that I'm using, a core loop is the simple set of repetitive actions that a player takes every single time they log into your game. It's a session loop that should be repeatable. People should leave the game expecting to return, and the design of this core gameplay is really to maximize the likelihood that the player will return. You're trying to drive habituation with your core loop. On the other hand, the metagame actually wraps around the core loop, and that's where most of your economy sits. That's where narrative and player aspiration fantasy sits. And the metagame is actually what drives most of the mid and long-term progression that the game players experience, as well as a lot of the monetization motivations and social systems. When you get the interaction between core games and metagames wrong, what you often see is games that have poor mid to long-term retention, and lots of different experimentation with new features don't change the equation. Typically in those situations, you have a generalized retention and monetization problem, but not a lot of specific theories as to what or why that's a problem. And you may have done substantial new development that doesn't fix the problem. There's a lot that goes into this, but when you get it right, your monetization improves immediately. And that power equates to better marketing, which then equates to stronger growth. It also has a side effect, which I actually sometimes think of the primary effect, which is the deeper relationship that you have with your players. You begin to understand what it is they need and want and why they play and what drives them to come back every day. And that's a really, really important thing to understand if you want to sell people stuff directly. It's less important to understand when you put ads in your game, right? If you want to go to this next level, you have to watch this ad. If you want these coins, you have to watch this ad. It requires a much deeper understanding of the player motivations if you expect to monetize people directly rather than give them stuff for free in exchange for spending some of their time watching an ad. I promised that I would tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm David Nixon. I'm the CEO of a company called Mobile Game Doctor. I've been making games since the early 90s, and I've actually shipped about 700 titles, which sounds like a lot, but as one of the preliminary players in PC download, we shipped a game every day. So, you know, my involvement in each one of those may have been a little light. I built and operated my first games as a service offering in 1993. It was a multiplayer, metagame-driven game service, kind of like Battle.net. I also helped to start Real Arcade, Oberon Media, and Xbox Live Arcade, and I was the VP of Publishing and Marketing for Wooga in Berlin. Most of my time has been spent product managing free-to-play games since about 2007. And for those of you who are interested in sending me an email, my email's on this slide. And Mobile Game Doctor is a consulting company that's been around since 2014. Our areas of specialty are free-to-play game design, product management, marketing, and data services. And we've got about 40 consultants around the world to help with those issues. I wanted to mention that some of these slides are quite dense. Don't panic. We're going to be providing the slides themselves as well as some other slides that I deleted to cut down the length of this presentation to anybody who wants them in PDF form. And that'll give you time to peruse some of the denser slides at your leisure. There may be information in there that's interesting to you. In this course of this presentation, I'll probably skip over those mostly. So before diving into in-app purchases, there are 3 things that you really want to know and you probably want to pass along to your teams. The first is there's no money button. There's no way that you can just say, I want more money. And if you do X, whether X is a battle pass or a targeted offer system or discount sales or a piggy bank or any of those other techniques that we've seen over and over again, none of those things is going to dramatically change your monetization without some underlying fundamentals being true. The second thing, and I think everybody knows this by now, but less than 10% of your players will actually buy anything for you. So if 10% of your audience actually spends money in your game, you're doing pretty well. And the third and most important is, if they're not playing your game, they're not going to buy anything. That is true of most players. There are some people called pathological purchasers, or I call pathological purchasers, that will buy something in your game as part of your trial experience, but there's not very many of them. Generally speaking, active, happy players are the ones that buy. And that leads us to the idea of retention as being critical to IAP success, and in particular, long-term retention being critical to IAP success. And when I say long-term retention, I'm talking years, not months. I did a consulting gig down in India a few years ago, and they said to me, our long-term retention is actually pretty good. And I said, oh, really? What's your long-term retention? And they said, our day 30 retention is pretty good. And I said to myself, day 30, geez, that's not very long. When I think of long-term retention, I'm talking like day 360, day 720, maybe even 4 or 5 years in. Like, there are games that I've worked on that retain players that well. And the reason that's important, I think many of you have probably seen this equation bandied about for the last decade. The key to success in any service game is that your lifetime value of your customer, your LTV, is greater than the cost of acquiring them, your CPI, your cost per install. Now, this is a dramatic oversimplification about how the industry works, but I want to focus in on LTV. LTV, when you go to project it, because it's very hard to measure until customers actually leave, is your average days played per customer times your average revenue per daily active user. That's the way most of the industry at its core projects the idea of how much money a customer is worth during their entire life cycle. If you look at this, half that equation is about retention. Days played is all about retention and engagement. ARPDAU is about monetization, of course, but if half the equation is about retention, then I think it bears a little bit more looking into. All games' retention curves look roughly the same. You've got what's called a power series curve, right? It's very steep in the beginning, it's very flat at the end, and there's some kind of inflection in the middle. And the difference between a good retention curve and a bad retention curve is a pretty subtle difference. And in fact, most of the difference actually lies in that flat line and how high it is above the x-axis. But even that subtle difference, when you start projecting LTV, turns out to be a pretty big difference in LTV. If you look at the blue line here, that's with the same ARPDAU. The blue line is a projection of the LTV on the bad retention game, and the yellow line is a projection of the LTV on the good retention game. And you can see that the longer that the player is in the game, the wider that gap gets. That's a pretty substantial difference as you get out towards 360 days. It's almost twice as much revenue generated by every single person who installs your game. The other thing that I want to talk about is that if your retention approaches 0 at any point, that's big trouble, because essentially what that means is that your LTV becomes flat, never increases anymore. And what that ultimately, given the dynamics of the mobile game ecosystem, what that ultimately means is there's a cap on your growth. Your business will never be bigger than a certain value if your LTV flattens out like this. And so if you ever see that your your retention line is approaching 0, that's bad, and you have to fix it. So when I have these conversations with developers, often the next question is, okay, I buy all that, but how does one go about impacting retention? Like, it's a lot harder to think about how you get people to stick around more and play more than it is to think about, well, what kind of offer can I give them to get them to pay? And that's fair. So I usually start by breaking down the retention curve into 3 different sections or phases. The first phase is at the very beginning with that steep downward slope. The second phase is the curve as the slope goes from vertical to horizontal. And then the third phase is that nearly horizontal line. I call the phase 1 people trialers. They're going to make a decision about whether they like your game in about 5 minutes or less, and there's very little you can do about it. Maybe a little bit in terms of making sure your game is stable, maybe a little bit in terms of your marketing, targeting, but generally speaking, within the first 5 minutes, somebody's going to decide if this game is for them or not. The second phase is what I call interested players. They've already come back, they're playing your game, but they haven't decided if they're going to stay. Your goal for these particular players is to convince them to go from being interested players to being super fans. And then the phase 3 description, actually, I think of these players as super fans. They're already habituated to your game. They're probably spending money, and they're probably not going to go away until something better comes along or until you break something. And then there's a special category of super fans called elder players, which are people that have basically mastered everything your game has to offer, but they're still engaged in the meta at some level. Phase 2, in my opinion, is the most important phase because that's where you actually have agency as a game operator to influence the way that players actually perceive your game. It also has a big influence on LTV projections. If you have just a small a small uplift in retention in the middle of that curve, you actually change how far the horizontal line is above the x-axis, and it actually has a pretty substantial impact in LTV all by itself. The reason for that is that a 10% in phase 2 retention results in a nearly 20% decrease in annual churn, which means you have 20% more players still in your game after a year. And through that whole time, they're watching more ads and they're buying more IAPs and they're talking to their friends and boosting your organics. So some key takeaways so far. This is the formula for LTV projection. Days played is about retention. So in order to have a high LTV, you probably have to have a high retention. Retention, long-term retention has a disproportionate impact on the development of your LTV. And there's 3 phases to an LTV curve: the steep downward slope where your trialers are, the flattening curve where your interested players are, and the nearly horizontal line where your super fans are. And the phase 2 is most important because making interested players into super fans is the key to success. And that's where the game has the most agency to actually influence the players' perceptions. I use a simple framework for designing for long-term retention that starts with a matrix that has a bunch of user lifecycle milestones from day 3 to day 720. And then on the rows, I ask my team 2 questions. Why is the player still playing at those different milestones? And why are they still buying? So that you have an idea of the depth of your economy. When you fill it out, it should look like this, but generally speaking, as you go through this practice for the first time, you find you have a lot of empty holes. And those are the places where you have to look really deeply in your systems design and decide whether your game is actually capable of retaining a player through that part of their life cycle. A lot of times development teams will get stuck filling out this table. The best way to get over that block is to have the people on your team fill out the table for a game that they love and play deeply every day. That gives them some practice as to what actually makes them retain through their entire life cycle and potentially allows them to apply those learnings to your game's design as well. There are a lot of common pitfalls, but I think the most common one is waiting too long to do this. You should have a good sense of your long-term retention design before you ever soft launch, because these are things that you're necessarily going to want to tell players about or tease during the course of their early stages of their life cycle, so that those things become the knowledge that those features or that content will exist in the future as part of what goes into their thinking in terms of whether or not they want to stick around or not. I'm going to skip this slide, but it's got some really useful information on it. Essentially, these are the top 5 problems that people come to me to try to address, and different ways, different techniques and features that potentially can address those problems. This is specifically for puzzle games, but it may be adaptable to other genres as well. So I want to talk a little bit about monetization next, but I do want to end this section with a warning. Don't start optimizing for monetization until you're really happy with your short and midterm retention. Part of monetization is about trading retention for money. And if you don't have some buffer to do that because your short and midterm retention is weak to begin with, you could inadvertently start a downward spiral that kills your game altogether. So be very sure that you've got good short and midterm retention before you start thinking about more aggressively monetizing people. At Mobile Game Doctor, we have a framework that we call CAPS for thinking about monetization design. And it basically focuses on players' motivations to buy in free-to-play game services. It's a mnemonic, CAPS, and it stands for cosmetics, access, power, and status. And it's a hierarchy with cosmetics being the weakest monetization motivation and status being the strongest, with access and power in between. So let's look at each individual one for a minute. Cosmetics basically are optional aesthetics that are non-functional and not visible to other people. And the primary thing that it does is it allows you to have some creativity and personal expression within your single player game experience. There are games like Pearl's Peril that have done really, really well with a cosmetic strategy. It requires an enormous amount of breadth of content and a very, very high fidelity of that content. Access, which is the next most powerful the next least powerful motivation, really focuses around shortcutting or speeding up progress or unlocking exclusive content or avoiding play limitations. There's a couple of games, or there's games that have done this very, very well, like Choices, where you had to buy new books or potentially pay hard currency in order to see the more interesting storyline developments, or just about any saga-based metagame that you've ever seen. Power is what people often refer to as pay to win. Power are bonuses or buffs that you can buy that allow you to defeat opponents more efficiently, or perhaps in a single player game, overcoming challenges that exist in the play balance itself, like very hard levels in a saga game that can be more easily beaten if you have certain boosts. And we've seen this all over the place, right? From 5-move continuations at the end of a failed level to consumable balls and more powerful golf club upgrades in Golf Clash. And then the most powerful one, but probably the hardest to pull off, is what we call status. And typically status is any publicly visible achievement, like leaderboards. The hard part about status is it requires community as a bottom line. People have to care about status, and in particular, care about their status relative to other people's status in order for status to work. One thing I will say is that when you can combine motivations, like in this offer in Gardenscapes, where you get both access and power, or the Battle Pass in Fortnite that basically touches on all 4 motivations, you get some very, very powerful monetization related offers that come out of tapping into all 4 of those motivations. But not every game can do that, because not every game has stuff that it can be sold for any given motivation. So some key takeaways: CAPS is an acronym. It's meant to describe the core player motivations for people who buy things in free-to-play games. It stands for cosmetics, access, power, and status. And it's a hierarchy with cosmetics at the bottom and status at the top. And if you can combine these motivations, that can be a big win. So moving into like, how do you start thinking about monetization design? There's 3 important things I want to convey before we dive into that. So the first is, it's really important that you know what you're selling, to whom, and that you have validated that they actually want it. I'm actually quite surprised at the number of developers that I work with who can't articulate to me what they sell. I mean, they can tell me what's in the game that can be purchased, but what are they selling? Are they selling access? Are they selling power? They don't necessarily know. They've just sort of emulated other people or other games that they've seen without really thinking too deeply about why people care. And I think the next most common blind spot is they are not sure who they're selling to, or they've not validated that that particular kind of player wants that thing at all. I have talked to a number of development companies who have Battle Pass-like features in their games, and the games are single player. I'm not sure a Battle Pass has much application in a game in which there's not competition. Maybe there is, but it seems like an odd fit to me. The second thing is that you want to be proactive and proficient to sell to your players. You can't just put a store in the game and expect people to go there and buy things. You actually have to understand what it is you're selling and tell players about it. And then the third thing is, it's pretty dangerous to go down the road of trying to optimize your monetization if you can't A/B test. It's a bit like driving down the freeway with a blindfold on. A/B testing allows you to see what the downstream effects are of a change that you make, and monetization changes can, by definition, really upset the balance of your game and players' willingness to play. A lot of times monetization changes that are too aggressive will have a positive short-term impact on monetization, but dramatically negative long-term impact on LTV. So A/B testing is particularly critical with monetization changes. To define what you're selling, you can use the CAPS framework to create a matrix. And then you can just write down what you have in the game and guess it where it fits. Some games won't fill in all of these boxes, but if you are able to at least categorize them, then I think that puts you a little bit further ahead in terms of understanding how to sell it to players and who wants to buy it. Selling proactively really comes down to understanding the value proposition. Why do players want this? Not what is it, but why do I care? And then what messaging is going to capture my attention so that I can buy it, and who's that messaging work for? Maybe it doesn't work for everybody. There's also questions of placement and timing. Like, when do you show me that offer? And how is this priced relative to other products, and why is that pricing the way it is? If you evaluate each of your product sales funnel like that, then you can do something like this that really sort of nails down, who is this for? How do we sell it? What's the messaging that we think is going to work and we can test? And where does it need to appear in the game to be effective? Again, touching on the importance of A/B testing, you need to be able to see where you're going, and monetization often has negative downstream effects in both LTV and retention. So you want to be able to identify those things, and A/B testing is the most reliable way to do that. There are some common mistakes around A/B testing. It's a complicated thing to actually get right, but there's lots of books and consulting available to you if you need some help. There's also lots of tools that will enable it for you more easily. But this is something that you want your product managers to dive a little bit more deeply into, to understand what A/B testing does well and poorly, and especially what kind of analytical capacity you have to have in order to be able to interpret the results effectively. So this is a table that addresses some of the more common requests that I have around monetization problems and solutions. I'm not going to go through it here, but if anybody downloads the PDF afterwards, you'll be able to see the details here. And I just want to go over real quick, in summary, the things that we talked about today that I think were most important and I want you to remember. The first is, if they aren't playing, they aren't buying. People who leave your game don't buy anything. You have to have happy, active, engaged players if you want to sell IAPs. And so monetization and retention are so tightly linked that it's not a good idea to try to approach either of them in isolation. Solve your retention issues first and then work on purchase conversion. This is something that's been really helpful for me over the years, to break down that retention curve into the types of players that are represented there and the types of behavior that we expect to see in each of those phases. And focusing on phase 2, that curve that determines how fast interested players become super fans, is really the place where your game systems have the most agency to influence player perception and behavior. I'm recapping some of the retention problems and solutions, and then remembering CAPS, cosmetics, access, power, and status, as the 4 primary motivators for why people purchase in games, as a hierarchy with cosmetics at the bottom and status at the top. Obviously, if you can come up with offers or systems in your game that combine 2 or more of those motivations, that can be very powerful for your players. Make sure you sell proactively and A/B test everything, especially monetization changes. MGD is here to help if you need us. Contact information is on this particular slide. We have very experienced designers, product managers, and marketers who can help you solve all of these problems. And thank you very much today for your time. I think we're going to go into some questions and answers as well today. And I think we actually put aside a fair amount of time in case people wanted to go into some of these topics a bit more deeply. Sam asks, can CAPS be A/B tested as well, like C against P? Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can A/B test anything against anything else. That's one of the neat things about A/B testing, is that you're essentially controlling for other variables like install user quality or whatever happens on a Tuesday. I think that the danger there is something that we call treatment effect heterogeneity, which is essentially the idea that different people respond to different things differently. And there's a whole sort of a whole nother topic of how you identify that and what you do about it. But it sort of leads towards personalization, where, you know, some different people might like cosmetics than like power. And so the right answer might be to show the right offer to the right people rather than suggesting that the two of them are completely independent. Matthias has asked how I see the future of premium mobile games, and how does the growth of handhelds affect the industry? Both are interesting questions. Premium mobile games are very difficult to market in the context of what we call traditional UA in the mobile game space, because by definition, your LTV is capped on a premium mobile game. You'll never actually make more money than it costs the player to buy the game to begin with. And so being able to buy a customer through traditional UA that costs you less than a typical mobile premium game sells for is very difficult. It's not impossible, but the whole industry is sort of reeling right now from essentially the collapse of the mobile marketing ecosystem and trying to figure out how to do things better. The growth of handhelds, we'll have to see. My suspicion is that at the very least, it's going to change play patterns for PC games. You know, I think if we look at if we were to do a deep dive on how people use their Switch, we see a preview of what might happen with other console and PC platforms because of the way that handhelds are coming up in demand and availability. Should monetization only start in phase 2? Is there anything that can be done in phase 1? So for certain kinds of games, it's reasonably for certain kinds of games, it's reasonably common for players to monetize in the first week. I think the important thing is that you probably don't want that monetization to block progress in the first week. And so, you know, a lot of times what you're doing is offering a welcome pack at a steep discount in order to drive that conversion earlier in the funnel and get people using the premium currency or whatever it is they're buying. I think that you're going to find it quite rare for a trialer to want to buy, like relatively speaking, because they don't know what they're buying in. Karen says, should games wait before displaying monetization options such as IAP or ads to a new player? I think what you're getting at there is sort of the idea that there are some players who perceive mobile games or free-to-play games as a way to separate people from their money, as opposed to providing good gameplay experiences. I don't think it's going to be a secret to any player that you'd like to monetize their game. Or your game, because otherwise, like, why would you be doing this? I actually think it's probably less damaging to be aggressive with IPs than it is to be aggressive with ads in the early stages of the game. I play a lot of games that even their rewarded videos, which are supposed to be sort of the least intrusive of the ad approaches, require you to spend 10 minutes watching an ad for every 1 minute that you actually get to play, and that's just out of whack. So, you know, I think that you should introduce your monetization systems early, but you should be careful about how intrusive you make them into the game experience. Carolina says, what about subscriptions for kids, apps, and games, for example? Subscriptions, in my view, are a kind of IAP. You're buying something, and then you're actually asking the player to go the next step and sort of commit upfront to buy something on a recurring basis. I think it works for certain kinds of content, not just games, but you see that in edutech a lot. And one of the really, really cool things about subscriptions is it's very, very easy to justify future revenue. So I think subscriptions is the right choice for some business strategies, but I wouldn't say that the underlying ideas of why somebody's going to buy something in your game stay the same, whether you're offering it as a one-time purchase or a subscription. Daniel says, my presentation is awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. Is there a way to measure how much content is needed for soft launch? You know, the truth of the matter is you need to give players enough content so that they, A, don't run out before you release your next round of content, and B, you have to present that in such a way that it seems like there's more content than there is. The best way to turn your players off is to give them the impression that there's an end, and that end is not so far away. So let's say you want to release 30 days of content. That makes a lot of sense so long as you know what the next 6 months of content is going to be, and you can promote it in the game, and you can release that content before players consume the first 30 days. Now, the tricky part about that is that 30 day is probably an average, which means some percentage of your players are going to do it in 15. But you know, what I basically tell people is if more than 5% of your people are at end of content, then it's time to upgrade your content pipeline. Let's see, any metrics for me to know when to start more aggressive selling? I'm not a big fan of aggressive. Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by aggressive, right? So I'm a big fan of telling players when something is on that is for sale that they're going to value. And I think you can be pretty aggressive about that because you should be doing that having been informed that that player actually wants that information. When you talk about, if you're talking about aggressive selling, meaning let's put up a paywall and let's not let the player advance until they've given us some money, I don't think that's ever appropriate. You know, I think that it kind of depends on what you mean by aggressive. What is a good release strategy for mobile games, and how do you salvage a failed mobile game when there's a few downloads in the first week? There are as many strategies for releasing mobile games as there are mobile games. I think that you should have two things in mind when you release your mobile game very, very clearly. The first is, who is your primary market? And I'm a big fan of winning at home before you try to win abroad. So it's much, much harder for a developer in Brazil to understand what an American customer wants and try to give it to them. And so I tend to tell developers who don't have the resources to hire people in their home country to do their marketing, to win at home first and then win abroad. So that's one strategy that I like to pursue. That also gives you a very clear picture of where to soft launch, because, you know, for a while, and it was a while ago, people were really fond of soft launching in places like Canada or New Zealand or even Indonesia, where users are cheap. Problem is that there's less and less indication that success in those markets is actually going to equate to success in your primary markets. So the second aspect of launch strategy that I like is launch where you want to be successful, and then treat each new region or new market as a whole new problem to solve. And then I think the third thing that I would suggest is that you lock down what is your effective marketing assets very, very far in advance, because that effort is effort intensive, it's time intensive, and most companies don't know how to market their game when they soft launch. Your marketing team should know exactly how they're going to market the game before you start buying traffic. Otherwise, you're just buying traffic inefficiently, and that is never going to work out well for anybody. In terms of how to salvage a failed mobile game, I guess it depends on the mobile game and the applicability of this to something else. Generally speaking, if you have one successful mobile game, then you can build a really interesting portfolio play, but getting that first success off the ground can be a challenge. Generally, I think that, you know, even a failed mobile game can have a reasonably productive part in an overall portfolio, but I don't know of any foolproof ways to salvage a failed mobile game when it's the only game in your portfolio. The question is, making a game without ads and then putting ads in would be harmful to the game over time? I don't think so, actually. I think that the idea, there's always going to, remember back in the beginning of the presentation, I said only 10% of your players will ever buy anything. There will come a time in the player's life cycle where it looks like that person is never going to buy anything. So there's really no harm at that point in starting to monetize them via ads. I think the reverse is not necessarily true. What I often see is people load up their game with, especially interstitials, which are particularly annoying, in the very, very early stages of the player life cycle. And what that basically does is it pisses off the people who don't want to stay in your game, and it also pisses off the players who do. And it pisses off potential buyers, right? So if anything, I would actually tend to start less aggressively at the start and then move towards a more aggressive ad strategy as player behavior becomes clear. Obviously, you're giving up quite a bit of potential revenue in those early stages when you still have those players who are only going to stick around for 5 minutes anyway. But the truth of the matter is, it's probably not worth the cost in retention to pursue that strategy, in my opinion. Let's see. Daniel's clarifying what he meant by aggressive: a larger gap between players who are buyers and players who are non-buyers. Okay, I still don't quite understand that, but maybe you're talking about pricing or offer timing. But basically, I think that the analogy that I would use here is that everybody hates spam. But all of us have newsletters or mailing lists that we subscribe to because we like it. And the bottom line is, the difference between spam and good marketing is that you don't notice the good marketing. And so I think that you should be as aggressive about selling your products and services inside your game as you can be without negatively impacting your game experience to the point where players leave. If you're sensitive to what customers want, then it's almost impossible to be too aggressive. Julia asks what my thoughts are on the concept of localizing IAB prices, particularly in regions where purchasing power is significantly lower. Really good question. What you're getting at here is going back to that idea of heterogeneity, right? Different people need different things at different times at different prices. If you're not doing this, you are definitely leaving money on the table in places with lower spend rates. I did a bunch of work in India a few years ago, and we were researching something that I call the threshold of triviality, which is, what is the highest amount of money that someone will spend without missing it, without caring, right? In the United States, that threshold is just about $20, which is why almost everything here is priced at about $19.99. You know, the average American will spend $20 and not think about it all that much. It's 3 cups of coffee, who cares, right? The interesting thing that we discovered in India is there is no such thing. Even the very, very highest economic tiers in India actually care a lot about every rupee. And they think very carefully about how they spend it. And so it was interesting to figure out a pricing strategy for something that's an optional luxury, like a mobile game, in the context of a spending environment in which people are that conscious about what they spend. So I think when I talk about the launch strategy of addressing each region or each market as its own individual puzzle to be solved, pricing is absolutely a part of that. So is bundle contents, or what are the primary motivations that you're targeting for purchasing? Matthias asked me, what resources do I recommend for studying the mobile game market? Gosh, it's funny. I was looking for, about 3 years ago, I was looking for the ultimate guide to free-to-play games. And I didn't find it out there. There's a lot of books that address individual aspects of running any kind of service-based business, really. But there isn't anyone that's written like the ultimate guide. And so I outlined it as a table of contents and then realized it was going to be like 10 years worth of work for me to do it. So I never actually wrote it. I would say there's an old book from the 80s that I often recommend called Why They Buy. It's a study of retail purchasing motivations that I think is interesting because it gets you sort of deeply involved in the psychology of why people spend money on things. There's a couple of books that I think are really useful when thinking about data-driven decision-making. One I have on my shelf over here is called Trustworthy Online Controlled Experiments, which is a useful mid-level resource on understanding how to do A/B testing effectively. But I can say that, something like App Magic, which is a market intelligence tool, can be really useful for understanding the dynamics of genres and certain types of games. But yeah, there's no one thing that I can point to and say, if you read this, you're going to be awesome. Let's see. Is it important to base the prices of your game based on the age group of people who will be playing? I would go so far as to say every game needs its own pricing structure. Any demographic segment is going to have its own pricing preferences based on a variety of factors. So it's not just age, it's geography, it's income level, it's spending history. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things that you should be thinking about pricing based on. But I think that in the context of a given game in a given region, there needs to be some logic to your pricing beyond, well, this person could spend $20, so I sold them something for $20. And most games deal with that by having a sliding discount level on bundles based on the price of the bundle. Blood Dragonor. From a gaming perspective and a free-to-play game player myself, I find that lots of free rewards, especially of value, can help retain players and are more likely to buy from free-to-play only lens. That's an interesting observation, actually. I am a huge believer that in the first 7 to 14 days of the player experience, you should give players lots of stuff. Once you get players used to spending hard currency or used to relying on certain boosts, it's much, much easier to get them to buy those things later. And essentially what you're doing there, because each game is its own ecosystem, right? What you're doing is you're saying, here, try this out. If you like it, you can buy more. Then as the player progresses through the game, you sort of scale back and make those rewards thinner and thinner. You can also use that as a churn management technique. If you see somebody's engagement is slipping and you want to get them back into the game, then you give away some stuff to them so that they can spend it and get moving again, sort of priming the pump. But, giving away stuff so that you can sell more of it later is a really, really good technique. Thank you. Carolina has asked if I could speak a little about premium games that have IAP. It's not so common in mobile, but it's very, very common in PC and console. I think it might be a superior method because you can essentially cover the cost of your marketing right out of the starting gates, and then all of your IP becomes your profit. you know, the challenge with the mobile space is that there is so much free content out there that if you're requiring people to sort of pay at the door, you may be putting yourself at a distribution disadvantage. But having seen sort of the economies that we see that do this in console and PC, I think it's actually a better model. It's just a question about whether or not you can get away with it in mobile. NeoWare has asked if I can tell us which mobile game genres are popular in 2023. Search for top grossing games in mobile, and that will answer your question. Excellent. Any other questions? All right. Well, I guess I'll hand it back to you. Thank you, Eliana, for the opportunity to speak to this group.
You're super welcome. Thank you very much, David. And for those who do not know, David will be here at Big Festival in person, and he will deliver a webinar, so you don't miss, and you can talk to him. So, obrigado a todos pela audiência. O David vai estar aqui no Big Festival. Ele vem, agora vai ser um frequentador assíduo. He's going to be always coming to Brazil now, right, David? And see you in June at Big Festival. Thank you very much.
I'm excited. I've never been to Brazil before. It'll be an adventure.
You're going to love it. You're going to love it. Well, thank you. Obrigado a todos. Thank everybody. Thanks Exola and Apex Brazil and Big Festival. Obrigado Exola, Apex Brasil, Big Festival pela parceria de colocar o David Nixon do Mobile Game Doctors aqui falando para a audiência brasileira. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.